webinars. My name is Brian Rose. I'm an Auxano Senior Lead Navigator. I've been full-time on the Auxano team for 10 years now, have been around Auxano and been part of developing tools and process almost from the beginning. I was on staff at local churches for 12 years and then was a lay leader in local churches and in architecture before that. So this is a fun role that God has me in this season. I'm very thankful for that. I live in the Nashville, Tennessee area. And of course, this weekend, I have to say, he is risen, right? And then so I'd expect to see some responses in the chat. If you know, you know. Todd, tell us a little bit about yourself. Todd Adkins from Lifeway Leadership. Go ahead and share a little bit about who you are.
So my name is Todd Adkins, and I'm director of Lifeway Leadership. Under Lifeway Leadership is things like church planting, church training, a tool called Ministry Grid that's used for both training and delivering digital curriculum in the church. And I've spent 17 years in church ministry in Cincinnati, Louisville, and then in DC for almost 10 years at McLean Bible Church, where I was one of the 2 XPs there. My main job there was strategic initiatives and staff development, which at that time meant campuses. And so just have a affinity specifically for staff development and making sure culture is maintained within that. And that's not because we did everything perfectly. That's just because what we learned over the course of time of, trying to mass produce and scale as quickly as possible. We went from 1 campus to 9 campuses in 4.5 years. And that was not without incident, but we learned a lot along the way. Currently, I've been at Lifeway almost 10 years now. We do leadership pipeline, events and coaching, and we also do several podcasts. I do 5 Leadership Questions podcast, New Churches podcast, which is now with NAM. So that's me and Ed Stetzer. And then finally, I do a 1 ministry question podcast that's just really short and sweet. And it is just all really practical, from a biblical perspective as pastors. We have 2 hats, the steward hat and the shepherd hat. And I always leaned toward the stewardship hat. I really, really love taking complex concepts and putting them into a visual format. And so 90-second leadership videos, if you Googled that, you would see a lot of those. There's like 150 of those that are just very simple things that you could really use to supplement yourself and leading your staff through, I think, really some real moments of opportunity when you gather them together for a staff meeting or whatever you're struggling with. We've got that. And then finally, I'm also here in Nashville, and because Brian said he is risen, I got to say he's risen indeed, y'all, because I'm back in the South. So
I love it. Yeah, let's practice that one for Sunday. Add the y'all on there. So the topic we're talking about, because this is where Todd lives at Lifeway Leadership, and we think about the principles there behind that. We want to think not just of succession. A lot of times that's just kind of a senior pastor, senior minister, senior leader conversation. But we want to talk today quickly about succession in every seat. And here's the reason. Because everyone's an interim leader. Every one of us leads in an interim form in the local church to one degree or another. Isn't that right, Todd?
Yes. And I think it's important to have this conversation because we think of the major disruption that, replacing the senior leader at a church is, and we fail to realize that is going to happen less frequently than at all the other levels in a leadership pipeline of your organization. Volunteers, that, leading level of a team member and team leader, and then, perhaps a director or coach level, you're going to have to replace those people a lot more, and they're going to have a major disruption effect on your church and ministry. So if you lose your preschool director for the 9:30 hour, we all know that is a really big deal. And wouldn't it be nice to have a succession plan in place for them as well?
Well, in some ways too, Todd, doing what we're called to do, and you experience this at McLean, I experienced this at the Met in Northwest Houston. as you multiply and maybe send to another campus or another church, you are, in some ways forcing some succession in there. So if we're not actively thinking about succession at every seat, then we can actually, in some ways, work against ourselves, actually multiplying and accomplishing the call we've been called to do. We can't very well send people to someplace new if we're worried about replacing them where they are now, or releasing leaders to their calling that God has placed in their life if we need them so much where they are. And so I think that's why this is an important conversation. And I want to say this too: successful succession requires both a plan and a pipeline. It's a plan and a pipeline. We talk a lot about succession planning, and there's some great ministry partners out there that do senior leader succession planning. I think about Will Heath and some others that are out there in the space doing some things that think from a visionary standpoint. But we want to also not neglect the thought that you need a succession pipeline at every level. And I think we see this biblically. Todd, I know this is a big part of your heart, and in some of the writing you've done, you've talked about succession planning, succession pipeline. We would call leadership pipeline, even
Right.
from a biblical perspective. Isn't that the case?
Yeah. I mean, first, I'd go back to what you said earlier about really replacement and
Yeah.
release. So there's a step in between there, which is reproduction. So we have to shift our thinking from just replacement when something happens to us. That's a reaction. If you want to respond to that long term, then you're going to actually not only have that plan in place, but you're going to create a pipeline so that there's consistent reproduction and releasing, because you may not have to replace everybody, but wouldn't it be nice to say we have so many people ready that we're releasing them into other new ministries? Our church is healthy enough that we're not just worried and concerned about announcing the same things over and over and trying to shove people into these key positions that we have to fill. And so we have an abundance of leaders. And so I think that's really important. But it does
Yeah.
start with a plan.
Yeah.
It starts with constructs. And so when you look at biblical examples of that, I would point to, the classic example of Moses. So Moses put constructs, he put systems and processes and structure kind of in place. You think of the Ten Commandments, you think of when he met with his father-in-law and said, man, these people are wearing me out. He said, you're right. They're going to wear you out, themselves out. It's not good for anybody. What you need to do is go back and put people over tens and fifties and hundreds and thousands, and really make sure that that span of care is ready for development.
Right.
Now, if you don't have those constructs in place, if you don't have those plans in place, what ends up happening is you as a staff person or a key leader in your church, you have way too many reports and you can't possibly develop them. All you can basically do is administrate and replace people, place people and replace people, not produce leaders or not reproduce leaders and volunteers. And I think that's a key part of this.
I love seeing that structure too of that, like you said, that span of care. At the end of the day, we can be so focused on leadership principles and practices and some of those things that we forget the whole point is being able to shepherd and care for the people well. And so I love kind of bringing that heart back. The reason we want to do this is because we want to shepherd and care for, not just because we want to grow an organization. Jesus did it a little differently, right? Jesus, kind of had his way, as always. I think about Luke 9 I think about Luke 9, and I think about the equipping, the principles, in some ways, the competencies Jesus was trying to instill in the disciples there. I know you're kind of pushing that there, Todd, to John 20. Tell us about that.
Well, I would say, what you're seeing there is the result of Jesus calling out the disciples. He gathered them together even before he began his public ministry. He had those guys and they were with him. If I look back to my own personal experience growing up in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, with one stoplight in the county, my dad was a bivocational pastor. And I can tell you, I do not want to stand behind this man in line in heaven, because on paper, I may have, served at more churches or bigger churches or whatever. And sometimes I feel like we treat certain roles in the church as a varsity and others as junior varsity. I'm telling you, I watched him over the course of my childhood develop other people. Everywhere he went, he had guys with him. So whether you look at Moses and Joshua, or you look at Jesus and the disciples, Moses, it wasn't just that he had the plan and the constructs in place. It was that he took Joshua with him up on the mountain. He took him when he got the 10 Commandments and broke the 10 Commandments. And he was there he was eavesdropping on God and Moses in the tent of meeting. When you look at the disciples now in the New Testament, you see Jesus choosing them and they went with him. And how did Jesus treat the disciples? Well, they were with him, they were around him, and he would preach to everybody and he would tell lots of stories. And then he would go back and he would break it down with the disciples. And they got to ask a little bit more questions and he got to answer those. And you see the gradual release of responsibility and ministry that he had to them through the New Testament. And it finally does really begin to culminate here, where it's like, as the Father sent me, so I send you. He has fully equipped them now and is giving them authority and responsibility, to carry that forward. And I think that's massive, whether you're talking about, yes, this is Jesus and this was, what Christianity is based on. But I think this scales up or down in our churches, whether you're talking about an usher who's been doing it for a long time, taking someone under their wing and saying, hey, it's not only enough to onboard you well and, train you a little bit. It's to say, hey, I'm going to be here and process some of this. When a situation happens 2 or 3 times a year, I'm going to take advantage of that situation and we're going to go back and break it down. But naturally, some people are more gifted in that than others. So we need to make sure that we're giving them, tools to use and a framework to use so that they have some clarity in being able to move forward.
I also feel like that 2 Timothy 2:2 is a classic kind of succession leadership, pipeline, example there of development when Paul is talking to Timothy there. How does that show up in your work at Lifeway Leadership, Todd?
Well, I would say, often we look at our legacy as unfortunately, we look at what we have done. And whether you looked at somebody's LinkedIn profile or I talk about my bio, what I should be talking about, what I'm more passionate about is understanding that my legacy will not be what I do, it'll be who I develop. And so, my proudest moments are catching up with people I haven't seen in 10 years. And, next week I'll be at T4G and I'll run into guys that, at some point in time were under my care and ministry. And, it's not taking credit for what they've done. It's really understanding, hey, here was my part. Was I faithful with these guys? And have they been faithful moving forward? When you look at 2 Timothy 2:2, the beautiful thing about it is you have 4 generations of reproduction. You have Paul to Timothy, Timothy to faithful men who will be able and do with others likewise. And I think it's important for us as ministers. We often look at this and we go, oh, they have to be this much ready. They have to have all of this training before they get any experience. And that piece that I would really pull out for us to understand is the faithful who will be able. And the larger our church is, or the larger our ministry is, usually the more centralized it is, because centralization is a result of, well, it's really a concern of risk or failure. And so, we put policies in place and we put all these things that really sometimes hinder the growth and development of people. So the key thing to remember here, go ahead.
No, I was going to, you finish that thought and then I'll jump in.
The key thing to remember is it's faithful who will be able. Yes, I want to give them, good training. But as long as they're, that good old saying from church growth years ago was look for fat people, faithful, available, teachable. And that's what we're still looking for today. And if they're
Yeah.
willing to come on board with us, then we can teach them a lot. That attitude and work ethic, whether you're looking at a staff person or a key volunteer leader or position, I think is the most important thing.
Yeah. I think we'll just kind of put a wrap on that. If we're going to be successful in succession at every seat, it takes really an expertise in developing, not doing, right? It takes us, and we all get that. I understood that early in ministry. I didn't really understand how to do it. I didn't have the system and process in place. I had an idea, maybe even had a plan in my head, but I never really developed that pipeline. It also takes an expectation of reproduction, not production. And I know, Todd, you like that phrase, reproduction, not production, and an ethos of building, not finding. Again, it's not that we're going to go find the next person we need. We're building the next person we need. We're not just trying to produce as leaders. And by the way, production really looks good at business meetings and some of those things, and some of the systems in our church are set to work against reproduction because they really push us to production. But the best we can do as leaders in the church is to reproduce ourselves and someone else, not do it all ourselves. And that's a developing doing. And I think we kind of summarize the biblical piece of that in those three phrases. Anything to add to that, Todd, as we're kind of taking the next steps forward?
I would say, one of the key things to remember here in the expertise in developing, not doing, it's not, the seminary training that we've had that says, oh, well, I can tell you 4 or 5 different discipleship models.
Yeah.
Or, hey, here's one that we can kind of take off the shelf. It really comes down to how you're spending your time. So if you break out your calendar of your week and you really walked through and you had 2 color highlighters and one was developing and one was doing, I double dog redneck dare you to do it. And don't let Satan talk you into this is both. You have to put it in one or the other. And it would shock you how much time you are doing versus developing. Right. And then I would also remind you of our one job in Ephesians 4 as church leaders is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, not do the work of the ministry. But half the time I think we fall short because what we do is we sometimes dump on people. We're just looking for that person to fill that spot. It is a leadership total placement mentality. Or we fool ourselves into thinking that delegation is development. In delegation, we're at least choosing the person for the task. And we're doing that. But I'd say the next level is that really developing piece. And that is building up the person, for the ministry versus being really task focused. I would say we need to be more people focused. Yeah. And then I think the reproduction versus production and the ethos of building, not finding, those things will follow as long as you focus on that first piece.
Yeah, it's always the question is, am I starting from the spreadsheet where I have the needs, or am I starting with the people who have the gifts and the talents, right? And if I'm starting with the people from the gifts and the talents, I bet I can find a place for them versus starting from the spreadsheet where I have the needs. Then I'm just trying to figure out how to plug the hole in. And that's a kind of a different mindset. I also like that idea of just building, not finding. We almost sometimes treat succession and kind of replacing people as if we're kind of walking along and find this, oh, okay, let's put this person in here and this person in here versus really taking a look at who's in our church, who's in our leadership, and starting really even from those early membership classes and kind of setting that culture of you have something to contribute here. God has given you gifts, talents, abilities, experiences, and there is a calling here, both in the organization, but also in the community to express that. And we're here to help you do that. Todd, I know in an ebook, we're gonna show everybody in a minute that's gonna be coming in an email to download. Real quick, just hit these 4 types of succession that are in the church. There's a lot more on it in the pipeline, succession at every level ebook. And then we'll get into kind of 7 steps to take to build that succession pipeline alongside your succession plan. But hit these 4 types real quick, and then we'll move forward in that.
So, you'll notice I end with number 4 as senior leadership succession. And that's because it's really important. Absolutely. The risk of vacancy there is probably higher than any other position that you have at your church. I get that. I understand that. However, we fail to consider the types of succession that we have at every level of organization, including the top. And that is unexpected succession is truly unexpected. That is, a lot of times churches will say they have a succession plan in place, and it's a folder that is sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere, and it's good for about the first 24 hours because it is the hit by a bus succession plan. And it has very little to do with like actually having someone ready and able to take over that position, regardless of the role. Usually it's a top role, but it's more about how to handle that situation and do damage control, in the first 24 hours to maybe a month if you're lucky. That's what our plans typically are. But unexpected succession happens at every level because it's much more likely, again, that one of your volunteers, a key volunteer, or a team leader, or a coach, if you're lucky enough to have a coaching level, or even staff people, either something happens to them, their health, a spouse gets a new job somewhere and it's 2 weeks later and they're gone. They have to take care of their parents, whatever it might be. We had some of this as an example in our own churches. I know you have. I'll talk a little bit more about a nuance of this. I'll go ahead and hop down to number 3 and then come back up to number 2. The temporary succession, we actually all felt, or all are probably still feeling as a result.
In some ways, we're still rebuilding around this because of COVID. And I think this is why this is an important conversation right now, because we get the chance to rebuild the right way versus kind of maintaining what was before, right?
Totally. So when you're thinking about temporary succession, I actually have a document that we may want to throw in here, Brian, that does volunteer audits. And I think we'll actually talk about volunteer and role audits a little later. But if you're thinking about temporary succession, there were people in your church that were on board with your vision and they were actively contributing. They were crew members. And because of their own health, or maybe somebody was vulnerable in their household, they had to step out of ministry. They had to step out of contributing by using their gifts in service to Christ in that way. Now, I would say a great thing for us to do is to consider that being a temporary succession point. Hopefully, we're going to bring that person back into that position or redirect them in a new position. But we can handle temporary succession where it is a COVID situation, or it is somebody who's saying, hey, for this 3 months, I'm going to go take care of a parent, or I'm going to really be focused on finishing my PhD, or whatever it is, where they have to take some time out, but we think they'll be back, if not in their current role, in a different role.
Or at least they tell us they'll be back, whether they really intend to or not, right?
Right. But that's one of the ways to think about, succession as well. Of course, senior leadership succession, we've talked about ad nauseum, and there's plenty of books and stuff out there. So I kind of want to keep today's conversation around, that 9:30 preschool hour director, man. That's a big deal to our churches. We all know that. We should act like it.
Well, there'll be more on that, and the ebook download will come in a link after this. I'm looking at the chat and prompting people. I use my iPad over here so I can see what's going on. And so if you see B's iPad, that's me commenting there. But one of the things came up. David said this: the most common statement I hear is, "I'm willing to help, but I don't want to lead it." And I was processing that, Todd, while you were talking there, and listening to you. I promised. But I do think that attitude stems from maybe some failures we've had in the past, right? And David's even kind of developing that, that thought even a little bit more over in the chat. Like sometimes as soon as somebody indicated a willingness, we've kind of just pushed everything over to them and then walked away because we got that thing filled. And so it may take in this new season of rebuilding our volunteer teams, reestablishing an ethos of building not just finding, of just in some ways even repenting and saying, listen, I'm sorry in the past what we've done. Because I'm thinking, why would somebody not want to lead? And really what they're saying, I think is, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, I think they're saying, a bunch of stuff got dumped on me last time, so I'll help out, but
Right.
I don't want, all those other things. And so, that's just kind of a reality of how the church was for a long time. It was like, man, you want to do this? Great. You're in charge of everything now. And you need to do this, and this, versus really helping develop people. And so we may have to apologize. We may have to repent. We may have to
For
come
sure.
back around and go, hey, listen,
So
we've done some things wrong in the past.
a big part of it is a lack of clarity. Even
Yeah.
if you had the best of intentions, you didn't have like a one-page job description for a volunteer role is absolutely essential, because you automatically give people a better sense of confidence when you provide them with clarity. You add just a little bit of training to that, and you get confidence and a little competence. We actually, when we look at training, I think often we look at it incorrectly because we think it's all about competence. And no, it's actually about as much about creating confidence that I know what I'm getting and getting into and stepping into, than anything else. So it can be a simple, checklist format, or it can be the way to actually do this, I think, and people not feel dumped on, is to have clarity up front on what you're asking, to have that one pager, to have some training, to have some common language across your church. The interesting thing is, from a Lifeway Research perspective, now this is like pre-COVID, this is almost 10 years old research. I think it's like 8 years old. But at that time, a volunteer served, if a volunteer was serving, they were actually serving in 2.67 roles in your church. Now, I don't know how that has shifted and changed since COVID. I would love for Lifeway Research to update that research, but I do know this. Anecdotally, if I look at my experience, that's true. I look at my experience at my church. I'm serving in a couple roles, and so I would assume that is still the case. We look like complete jackwagons when we don't have a systematic way across the church of bringing on new people, a cadence of meetings, something that helps people understand that we're kind of coordinated, because it's not the children's ministry doing whatever they want to do, the student ministry doing whatever they want to do, groups or Sunday school doing whatever they want to do. When everybody's onboarding is all across the place and applications are all across the place, if they have them, it's just really bad. One more thing, sorry, I know you want to probably move us along, but I have one more thing to say that's really important. This is a great exercise for you, and it's also a great exercise if you're lucky enough to have a staff person or two, or do this with a key leader. Ask them if you can shadow them, or ask them to record themselves recruiting somebody in the church, that conversation. Because here's what often we do. We downplay and say, oh, well, anybody can do this. If I'm a leader and you tell me anybody can do this, I don't want to do that. Well, good, go get somebody else. We say no for people. Hey, I know you're already busy. I know you have a lot on your plate. I know you already, whatever it is, we often will say no for people as we're trying to recruit them. There's all kinds of little things that we do there that really suggest that we're just looking for a warm body. We're not looking for, a weekly volunteer. Even the way that we set up our volunteers sometimes. Oh, I just need you to serve once a month, because we've gotten to that point where we're so desperate, that's what we have to do. And that's an indication that we have a dumping mindset, or at least not a mindset, but I don't know. We have a dumping culture.
Yeah, in some cases we feel that. I mean, as I was looking at David's follow up in the chat, when we're in some of the smaller churches, I helped a church plant that had grown really big and kind of collapsed on itself rebuild in Northeast Georgia, and we were in that stage. We had 200 or so people, and we had all these nursery spots to fill and some of those things, and the reality was we had to scale back. I mean, we had to kind of right size what we were doing. If we were going to develop people well, we couldn't do everything we wanted to do right away. We had to say, hey, what are the things we can do? And then, be very clear, as you're saying there, Todd, that in that clarity, we had confidence. We could have confidence in our leadership, what was happening in those rooms, because we couldn't be everywhere at the same time. But also they had confidence that we weren't putting them in something that was above their heads. And what ended up happening is you started to see passion come out of that confidence. You started not just competency come out of that, but a passion come out to lead. Todd, I grew up in North Alabama, and I have the memory. I can still taste in my mind what garden hose water tastes like. On those hot summer days, we just turn on the hose and drink out of that. Right now, I feel like having a leadership conversation with you is like a hose that doesn't have but one setting, just wide open. And now I'm sitting here trying to figure out how to pinch and twist to kind of slow the flow down, because there's so much good leadership content coming out. And so I'm kind of, I feel like I may be, getting hit in the face with a hose full of water as we talk about leadership. And I love it. I think it's huge. It just makes me wonder what our next webinar needs to be on, and that. Let's talk about 7. I hope that's not offensive. I hope that's funny.
No.
7 strategic steps for establishing succession in every seat. A lot of words there, but really just some thoughts here. I'd say first, and this comes back to that clarity piece, we got to cast a vision for succession. We have to cast vision, and this is completely scalable. It's completely scalable, whether we're a church of 150, 1,500, or 15,000. We have to cast a vision for succession. And I think remember, vision is living language of God's better future, right? We're thinking about and talking about, hey, listen, every one of us is replaceable. Every one of us has something we need to do next. We're continuing to say, hey, what if 5 years down the road we had this? What if 10 years down the road? And that really paints that picture of ongoing development. Really kind of, I love what you said, Todd, of not just talking about it, but doing it, having people around. What does it look like in 10 years, 5 years? Not just kind of what we want the church to be from a scale side of things, or what we want to accomplish in the community, but we want to have leaders crawling all over this place. We want to have people who are being developed in their calling, being developed in their skills, growing in their passion for ministry. And it starts with us who are in leadership roles casting a vision for that. Like saying, hey, look around this room. I teach a college small group, lead a college small group every Thursday night. They're coming back over this evening. We're recording this on Thursday. And I told them at the beginning of the semester, I'm going to ask some of you to step up through the semester, not just because I travel and will be gone on Thursday nights, but because that's a part of this developmental mindset. So I cast vision from the very beginning. Some of you will be asked to do this. And so I wanted to plant in everyone's mind, hey, listen, all of us should be able to do this as we walk with Christ. We should all be able to lead a group and to do that. So I think that first piece is casting a vision. Obviously, clarity is a word that's close to the Oxano heart. The next one is build a culture of succession. So we got to cast a vision for it, but it also takes a culture. This comes back to sometimes that I don't want to do it. I don't want to be the leader, but I will be a volunteer. I think that's a cultural thing. And at Oxano, we would say it's critical to name the values that drive culture, right? Values are core convictions that drive consistent decisions and ultimately shape culture. So if you don't have a value, written word, language, core value, I'm speaking about specifically, yes, you need those words. You don't just need to kind of hope that it happens. If we can't point back to saying, hey, listen, this is our value about, everyone is replaceable. And that, that feels negative, but it's also could be super positive, or some other, serving passionately, like everybody's got this role they're called to do. If we don't point back to something that's consistent and drives decision-making, then it won't happen, right? It won't happen if we don't have that point that we can both make decisions from and call back to. I was having a conversation with a leader this week, and this phrase came up: culture isn't built in the shadow of convenience. You can't build culture by always trying to do what's convenient, what's easy, some of those things. Sometimes you have to call people out. And Todd, I think this gets back to that. If anyone can do it, then why would I do it? Why do you need me to do it? Right? Tell me why this is something that's unique and I need to do it. And I think calling people to be a little inconvenient, we were talking in that conversation about developing volunteers in a ministry and you know, bringing them together consistently. And he's like, well, we're just trying to find a convenient time to do that. I'm like, wow, but you can't build the culture you're looking for in the shadow of convenience. It takes making decisions and forcing people to see, hey, this is important enough because of this value to do that. Anyway, that's what we do at Oxano. We have, most of you are already familiar with what we do, so this isn't new to you, but in that vision framing process, we really anchor the language of values, language of mission. That John, so send I you kind of moment that we sing when we send missionaries is really about sending people out every day. And it's a great commission call that shapes the work we do. And so that's kind of a fun piece of vision framing sometimes to see it through that lens. Todd, I'm gonna throw to you. Establish a succession pipeline team. What do you mean by that?
I mean, first and foremost, you actually do want to start with those vision and values. When I look at making sure everybody's on the same page, it's easy for us to think that that happens just because of what we say from stage.
Right.
And eventually it has to make its way from the stage down into the body and then go deeper and deeper and deeper as people get in deeper and deeper involved in our ministry and are serving at higher and higher levels. So think about it this way. There's a 7S framework. It's a business framework from McKinsey. So, if you Google 7S framework, you'll see that this is a business framework used by Fortune 500 companies. But I think it's very applicable to what we do, even more applicable because of who we serve and who we're trying to become like Jesus. So when you look at how he communicated, he started with story. And so, yes, absolutely, culture eats strategy for breakfast, but it gets its appetite from purpose. And if our purpose is making disciples who make disciples who make disciples, awesome. What does that look like at our church? Well, here's our vision and here's our values. Every time I get up and say those things, I want to make sure I have a personal story from our church to go with it. And why? Because, well, what we celebrate, what we measure and control, like you were talking about in that previous frame, what do I control? What do I push back on? All those things are really important to embedding culture. But the number one piece, I think, is story. So if we want a reproduction culture, if we want a culture of natural succession happening all the time, it really comes back to story. So we want stories. We're not saying, hey, Miss Mabel spent 86 hours pulling off VBS this year. Everybody, let's clap for her. Yeah. What we want to do is bring up the small group or the Sunday school guy who represents Paul, Timothy, faithful men who would do likewise. We need to get those guys up there and say, hey, hey, look at this. This is awesome. These are normal people in our church. Miss Mabel can do that because she's retired. And everybody else looks at Miss Mabel and says, there's no way I could do that. But these guys all have jobs and they've all somehow found a way to lead a small group, or they've all somehow found a way to work in our auto ministry that helps, fix people's cars who can't afford them, or whatever it is. Think about every time you share value, embedding that story piece. The strategy piece comes next. Then the structure, which we've kind of already talked about, structure and language, then systems, then the skills or the actual training that we do. Those can be soft skills and hard skills. Those can be around our values, or they can be, hey, this is an usher, here's how we handle the money. But regardless of the role that somebody's in, they need, some training that goes with it. Finally, if you want to get to that last S, you can either go with selection or really style of development. I've interchanged those a couple different times over the years, but it really is important who you select, because it's great when we have our vision and values clarified. But what we have to remember is people are carriers of culture. And so what we're trying to do in these, 7 steps really is to get these vision and values into the lives of the people and recognize the stories that they tell in the hallways, the myth and lore, that is, hey, if you're in children's ministry, here's what this value means, and you tell a story. And that story becomes, the lore in the children's ministry that goes along with this value. So I just think those are really important. So story, strategy, structure, systems, skills, and style or selection there. So you'll see all those broken down. If you download that ebook, you'll see that. And
Okay,
any
those are in the
pipeline
ebook.
ebook I've ever done, you'll see
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Let's talk about really quickly competencies at every level, Todd. We want to cover a lot of ground in the next 5 or 6 minutes, but I think this is a great illustration of what the difference is, and then we'll move through the last 3 pretty quickly.
So most of us, if we're willing to admit it, we are sacrificing giving the ministry away on the altar of something. It's either it's easier to do myself, it's control, it's pride, whatever it is, it's time. It's just quicker for me to do. Whatever it is, we kind of we have one of these 3 mentalities. This is your choice. You can be an Iron Chef, you can be grandma, or you can be Betty Crocker. Iron Chef is the kind of person, whether it's a staff person or a key ministry leader, is the Iron Chef is, the show where you don't know what ingredients you're going to get. And it's Sunday morning. I have no idea what I'm going to get. But only I have the skills, the experience to pull together these disparate ingredients and make a beautiful cake. That's one mentality. Then you have the grandma mentality. We love grandma, and grandma makes a great cake. My grandmother made a jam cake that would change your life.
Coconut
Unfortunately,
cake. Mine was coconut cake, and
when I get to heaven, I will hug Jesus, and then I'll look around his shoulder to see if my grandmother is holding a jam cake. That's what I'm looking for. Now, here's the thing. In our family, there's a debate because we don't have the recipe. Did grandma just not ever take the time to write down the recipe, or did she enjoy being the only one who knew how to make the jam cake? Debate's still out. We all have people in our churches that have been doing stuff for years, and they've never reproduced themselves because they've never taken the time to write down the recipe or pass it along at the very least. Now, if we want to scale succession in our churches, if we want to scale reproduction in our churches, what we have to do is take that recipe. We need to mix all the dry ingredients together and make it, hey, here's 4 steps to do this. I'm going to put it all together for you. You mix this for 2 minutes, add 2 eggs, set the timer, and ding, 30 minutes later, I've got a cake. Now, you might argue it might not be as good as the Iron Chef or grandma. Grandma would probably not argue with you. Iron Chef would say it's not as good. It's not as good. Betty Crocker's not as good. And I would say, yeah, it might not be a 10, but Funfetti is still a solid 8.5. We'll both eat it, won't we? Yes. And over the course of time, that volunteer or that leader is going to doctor that thing up. We know they're going to go full cake doctor on it, and they're going to add their own stuff, and it's going to kind of become their own. And effectively, what that Iron Chef has done is given their ministry away, which they're called to in Ephesians 4. That's where their glory is in giving the ministry away. That's how they bring God glory, not by doing it all themselves. So that's basically that framework. And as I went through there, you probably had a couple people in mind. So if you do, an exercise after this would be, okay, who are my Iron Chefs? Who are my grandmas? And how do I, make ministry checklists? How do I create job descriptions and things to make it where I can put it in the box?
Let's move quickly. Install development mindset in every ministry, Todd. This is pretty much the what we've all been taught. I do, you do, all those kind of things. What's kind of the one quick nugget you'd add to making sure we see this?
I would say the difference between this and what you've probably seen before, this is an educational framework from the 80s that, the church already took it a long time ago. The difference here is the we talk element that you may not have seen before. And that is understanding that it's not just a transfer of knowledge and experience like a classroom where, it's the knowledge is displayed through testing and writing papers and
Yeah.
You have to get so many hours. What this recognizes is there's transformation happens and responsibilities transferred when you have an overlap of knowledge, experience, and coaching. What this does is also understands that 67% of people are visual learners. And if I give you this framework and walk you through it and say, hey, we're moving from intentional to guided to collaborative to equipped. And I am expecting you to do this with somebody else. Once you learn this ministry, I want you to lead in this ministry and multiply yourself. I'm moving you, even though you're a volunteer, you may stay a volunteer for 30 years. I don't care, but your number one responsibility is to move from learning this and becoming competent to leading it and being competent, there. But it's really to multiply yourself. And I'm giving you a framework to make that happen. The other thing that I would say is really important to recognize, Brian, and I know we're running out of time, is you're moving people from fear to competence and confidence when you go through this process, because it's easier for me to ask you to stay after and watch how I led the small group and we talk about it than to say, I want you to be my apprentice. Instead I say, oh, intentional guided. I'm moving you from comfort. I'm bringing you into being a little uncomfortable, but I'm still here with you. Then I'm releasing you slowly. I'm still here with you. You gain that competence and confidence, and then you're actually equipped. If you want to look at it this way too, I'm moving from directive to supportive. I'm moving from telling you how to do it and what to do to just supporting you. And my time goes down it takes a lot of time at first, but then it goes down. All right.
Right. And I think that first, the amount of time it takes at the top of that left-hand pyramid inverted is what keeps us from ever seeing the bottom of the other, is because we just can't get past, we can't prioritize the time there. Another thing that takes time, and we're gonna just kind of move through this quickly, is just regularly reviewing the roles and plans. And here's the assumption: you have roles and plans delivered, you have them established, right? You can't audit or review something that doesn't exist. And so, we're starting and maybe making an assumption there's a baseline there, but we have seasonal or annual ministry role audits, volunteer audits. And I think this is just that culture of development that gives us permission to say, hey, this was good. This could have been better. And it's not anything personal. We're not coming at you in this, but like, hey, listen, here's what we're going for. Here's what the plan is, and here's how we can do better. And I think leaders value those things. We're going to go on to this potential successors, and we don't need to explain the 9 box because we could do a whole webinar on this 9 box.
Yes.
But just putting potential and performance beside each other when you're looking at successors. And is this in the ebook download, Todd?
It's in the ebook. There's also a course that goes along with the ebook. And in the ebook, I'll tell you this, there's all kinds of different exercises. Again, what my job, I feel like, is to, not be the hero with your staff or with you, but allow you to go through with this with other people and do the exercises. So if I were to encourage you on this piece, this is not like trying to put somebody in a box and say whether or not they're worth investing in. It's to get you clarity really quickly to say, hey, who might a potential successor be? And based on where they are in this, I can then effectively have a development plan for them. So if I just say, who's your potential successors? Or if I just say, hey, how are you going to invest in Brian or develop Brian? You'll just kind of make it up on your own, or you'll do it from an emotional standpoint. This takes the emotions out of it and just says potential performance, boom, I now have clarity on what I could do with this person. And it's fun because, you get to say, oh, is this person a poser or a prodigy? Which,
we may not use those words out loud, but they're there. So we'll send this, guys. We'll send this PDF out. I know we've kind of moved quickly through, but as always, next steps are critical for us, Oksana. We use the phrase "go ahead." Here's how to go ahead: pray, discern what God is doing inside of you, and then start developing. Here's some ways we'll help. We'll send this in the email. 2-day vision planning retreats. Always thinking about the future and how do we structure that development mindset, multiplication mindset. Oksana, our team of navigators, come in and work through a proven process for 2-day retreats. Longer term vision framing processes, helping cast and create that culture and really understanding in the context of who you guys are. Do this now, Todd. I know you're offering webinar listeners a preview of Ministry Grid. You spoke to what Ministry Grid was earlier. We'll put this link in the email. Do you want to say something real quick about it?
I would say if you think you're familiar with Ministry Grid and you haven't been on in a year or two, then you're not familiar with Ministry Grid.
Okay.
It's the way that Lifeway delivers its curriculum and its training now, and so it
Great.
is it is tremendously transformed itself. The other thing I would say is if you are on Ministry Grid and you don't know if you're using it to its full effect, what that link will do is allow you to get connected with the individual on our team that actually can give you a personal demo.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's
Full
for
utilization.
yeah,
Perfect.
Oxano partners. You guys always get the white glove treatment.
Yeah, we